Hello, everybody. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you at the actual time of this lecture. The time difference didn't really quite work out for me. And at the time that you will be listening to this, I'm leaving Sydney to lead one of my literary tours within Australia. But I'm delighted to be joining you in some form as a fellow member of the Anthony Trollope Society. Been a member for many, many years, so it's really lovely to meet you via Zoom and via this talk. So today I've chosen to give a talk on the strength of beef and the inspiration of ale, looking at Anthony Trollope and food. And there, of course, we see our revered author, a huge favourite of mine. His novels have given me enormous pleasure over the years, and I don't need to tell you that because, of course, I'm preaching to the converted. Now, the American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne once commented in a letter to a friend that the novels of Anthony Trollope were written on the strength of beef and through the inspiration of ale. He went on to say they exactly suit my taste. I think actually Trollope and Hawthorne formed something of a mutual admiration society. In the year 1879, Trollope wrote an essay called The Genius of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And clearly, Hawthorne loved Trollope's novels. Trollope also knew Nathaniel Hawthorne's son, Julian, and he had met Nathaniel Hawthorne in the year 1861. And he thought him one of the handsomest men he had ever seen. And judging from the portrait I showed you just a moment ago, I think he was an extremely good-looking man. Now, Trollope in his novels, and I'm looking at this quote by Hawthorne on the strength of beef and the inspiration of ale, certainly gives us a lot of food and dinner parties and eating and drinking in the novels. We get wonderful formal dinner parties, which don't always go right within the novels. We get more informal ones. We get dinners at inns and at gentlemen's clubs. We get picnics, we get afternoon teas, and well-buttered muffins quite frequently put in an appearance. So I think Trollope knew what he was doing when it came to writing about food. And he uses food in very interesting ways within his fiction. Food reveals character to the reader. Sometimes it even assists in courtship. It damages people's health when they have too much of a good thing. And of course, with Trollope, it always provides wonderful opportunity for conversations. So let's begin by looking at Anthony Trollope's own taste in foods. And this shows some entrees in an illustration from a Mrs. Beeton cookbook. Now, there's no doubt that food in Anthony Trollope's day was very heavy indeed. Lots of roast meat, mutton was a staple, often with fairly hot sauces and rather fiery condiments to go with it. Perhaps because the meat itself was so bland and frequently overcooked, they needed sauces to liven it up a bit. Foreigners to visiting Britain would comment on this, and cayenne and chili vinegar and spicy ketchups were used frequently in the recipes of the era. There had, of course, given the nature of the British Empire, been a great deal of influence from India, and curry was very popular in Trollope's day. His wife Rose used to make curried salmon for her mother-in-law, and that seems to have been something of a family favourite. But curried oysters, even curried macaroni, got served in various places. And if you think of another great Victorian novel, although set a little further back in the past, Thackeray's great Vanity Fair, you might remember Becky Sharp eating curry and thinking that a chili would be a delightfully cool thing to eat that would take away some of the heat of the curry. How very wrong poor Becky is. Salads were served, but usually undressed. A dressing on a salad was rare. And almost invariably, vegetables were grossly overcooked in Trollope's day. In fact, there was generally a belief that it was unhealthy to have your vegetables in any form of crispness. And Trollope seems to have felt that carrots needed to be boiled for at least an hour to make them palatable as vegetables. So no crunching on a nice raw carrot for Anthony Trollope. Trollope very much believed in the formality of a dinner. He liked to dress for dinner so that he would appear appropriately garbed for the appropriate occasion. In his novel Ayala's Angel, which I think is a fabulous book, he comments, "The man who ceases to dress for dinner soon finds it is a trouble to wash his hands." So clearly you're sinking into the depths of iniquity if you do not dress for dinner. And Trollope, of course, really cared about his food. In 1882, he invited himself for lunch at the home of his brother-in-law, John Tilley, who you can see in this picture. And he declared, as he invited himself, that he really only needed a little bit of cheese and a crust of bread. When he arrived, he was taken into a room, and he found there, to his absolute horror, the tail end of a stale loaf, some mouldy bits of cheese, and a jug of water. He looked at it in total horror and then was told that proper lunch was being served in the dining room. And Trollope got the joke and roared with delight at his own foolish statement that a bit of cheese and bread would do. Now, after Trollope moved to Waltham House, he would still visit London, and of course, he could enjoy London meals. He liked to stay at Garland's Hotel that you can see in this picture. It was in Suffolk Street in London. And sometimes he enjoyed breakfasts at the White Horse Cellar in Piccadilly. And of course, as a good club man, he dined very frequently at the Garrick Club. Trollope was elected a member of that club in the year 1862. Now, as any of us know who have managed to put on a few COVID kilos, lots of eating has an unfortunate effect on the waistline. And Trollope certainly had this problem. He did put on weight over the years. And in 1864, he decided to try a fashionable diet. And this was produced by a man called William Banting in 1864. Now, evidently, William Banting had been seriously obese. He had designed his own type of diet, found that it was very successful. He slimmed down wonderfully. And so he wrote this letter on opulence. And it was an extremely popular publication. It was addressed to the public with a diet plan. The diet plan included 4 meals a day, but no alcohol, no carbohydrates, no sugar, and no fat. So I guess you did lose weight if you went on William Banting's diet. The diet book was so popular that the word banting actually appeared for a while in the English language as a euphemism for slimming. And people would say to each other, "Oh, are you banting at the moment?" or "Do you bant?" This became a very sort of popular use of a way of talking about diets. So Trollope tried the banting diet in the year 1864. And his good friend George Eliot commented that he was a little thinner, and she thought he seemed a bit better for the self-denial, but it didn't last, as so many of us find when trying diet. In the 1880s, Trollope's weight was about 225 pounds, so he needed to go banting again in the 1880s. He once commented to a fellow diner, "Thank God I am very greedy." So I think he loved his food, and denying himself food was something he found very difficult indeed. Now, when Trollope went travelling, he found it rather hard to go without good dinners. And he found often that railway food was rather substandard. He wrote, "The real disgrace of England is the railway sandwich, that whited sepulchre, fair enough outside, but so meagre, poor and spiritless within." So buying a railway sandwich, and you can see some for sale in the picture, was not something that Trollope happily did. This shows the SS Great Britain, the ship on which Trollope travelled to Australia. And there, of course, he was able to dine reasonably well because he was in the first class saloon. And dinner on the SS Great Britain offered 22 main courses, including turkey, duck, pork, and lamb. Amazingly, for a ship out at sea, fish does not seem to have been a major item on the menu. I've always been fascinated by Trollope's visit to this part of the world. He went to both Australia and New Zealand. He wrote a travel book on those countries. I grew up in New Zealand. I now live in Australia, so I can very much relate to the places that Trollope visited and his comments on what he saw. Now, when he arrived in Australia, his son Fred actually had a Chinese cook for the shearers who worked on his property. Trollope was rather worried about travelling to this part of the world and whether he would be able to get decent food. So he and Rose took the really extraordinary step of taking their own cook out to Australia with them. Her name was Isabella Archer. Now, unfortunately, almost as soon as she arrived, she met an Australian man who decided he would like to have her come and cook for him as his wife. So Isabella Archer got married, and the Trollopes, having gone to all the trouble of bringing their cook out to Australia and no doubt paying her passage, found that they were without their cook. Generally in Australia, he was very disappointed by the wines, and he was a man who enjoyed good wine. He felt the best wines were in South Australia, but the brandy, another drink of which he was very fond, was, he said, a villainous, vitriolic, biting compound. So I don't think he was impressed by the brandy he got in this part of the world. He did, however, find the meat excellent and remarkably cheap, and he writes a lot about the meat in his book. His book stressed that an Australian labourer could eat 3 meat meals a day at very little cost. And of course, for a very long time, that was the case in Australia. You know, it would be a steak for breakfast, a steak for lunch, and more steak for dinner. There was plenty of meat available. So Trollope was very interested in how this great supply of meat in this part of the world could be transported to people who needed some meat in Britain. He was interested in this surplus meat issue and how it could be preserved in a state that would get it to Britain and still be edible. Before leaving England, he had actually tried some, quote, Australian preserved meat as an experiment. It cost him 6pence for a pound of meat, and he was not particularly impressed. He wrote, "It was sweet and by no means unpalatable, but was utterly tasteless as meat." Now, artificial methods of freezing were being considered at this time. And what Trollope noted in Australia was that the meat from the sheep was being boiled down to an essence, and the essence would be packaged up and sent off to those poor meat-deprived people in Britain. So Trollope sampled this essence while in Australia, and he commented quite wonderfully, I think, as though he were pervaded by meatiness for many hours. He almost felt as if the meatiness was seeping out of his pores, and he was not impressed. But he certainly hoped for the day when palatable and nutritious Australian mutton and beef would be sold in English shops. One of the things that he tried while he was in Australia was stewed wallaby. He spells wallaby W-A-L-L-A-B-I instead of ending with a Y. And he was not impressed by this either. He said it was not nice to eat, even when stewed to the utmost with wine and spices. He did, while in Australia, enjoy the fruit, pineapples and oranges. It went down very well indeed. And in his book, or his novella really than a full novel, Harry Heathcote of Gangoil, which gives a wonderful picture of an Australian Christmas, he depicts the poor wife, Harry's wife, busy in the kitchen, worrying about cooking the mutton in the heat of an Australian Christmas day. So I think this might have been something of a novelty for most British people at the time, unable themselves to travel to Australia, to read something about a hot Christmas day and the cooking of the mutton for the Christmas table. I've always loved the fact that I think I'm correct in this, that the only place in the world that has been named for our beloved Anthony Trollope is in Australia. It's this little stretch of the Hawkesbury River at a place called Wiseman's Ferry. And I have picnicked there with a group of fellow Trollopians, which was huge fun. Trollope had a picnic there with various Australian dignitaries. They were on a boat trip on the river. He thought it was a wonderfully impressive river that could equal the Rhine in Germany. He was there in 1871, but sadly he did not recall what was eaten for the picnic. So although my group of friends and I were able to replicate the picnic, we could not replicate the actual picnic fare as we sat there at Trollope's Reach, enjoying a picnic in honour of one of our favourite novelists. Trollope, as you all know, did travel very widely. He evidently once had an argument with his good friend Nathaniel Hawthorne about the quality of English peaches. Hawthorne thought they were tasteless and Trollope defended them very vigorously. When he travelled to America, he was amazed at the eating habits of young American children. He saw them dining with adults in American hotels. And he felt that really perhaps in England, the children were left at home and the adults would go to hotels without their children. But he comments, but at hotel life in the States, the adult infant lists to the waiter for everything at table, handles his fish with Epicurean delicacy, is choice in his selection of pickles, very particular that his beefsteak at breakfast shall be hot, and is instant in his demand for fresh ice in his water. Trollope noted that American love of ice, and if any of you have been to America in recent years, they do go through vast quantities of ice in their water. So dining and what was put onto a table at a dinner party was changing enormously during Trollope's lifetime. In his youth, what was common was something known as service à la française. So all the food in a course was put on a table, as you can see from this menu plan with all of these different dishes. They would all have something different in them. So it made a very impressive table display of different terrines and dishes. And diners would help themselves to whatever was near to them. However, if you thought there was something particularly delicious looking up the other end, it was your bad luck. You couldn't get it unless you happened to be sitting right next to it. It looked very impressive, and this menu shows a great range of birds and different types of meat and fish. But things began to change, and service à la Russe got introduced during Trollope's lifetime. And this became the norm in English dining rooms around about the 1870s and 1880s. This meant that you no longer had all the food on the table. You can see from this table plan that the diners were sitting there with their plates and their great range of cutlery and a few nice decorations on the table and no doubt candles and things like that. But the waiters would come round and would serve you the food directly onto your plate. So this meant that the food was hotter by the time you got to eat it. The diner could have particularly what he or she wanted. So you weren't lusting after something at the far end of the table. But there was certainly less of the effect of magnificent profusion. And one can imagine some of Trollope's characters who are out to impress and want to make sure that the guests at their dining table are very much overawed by the ceremony and the plenitude of dishes on the table. So the service à la Russe demanded a great deal more tableware. So because you had to, have all the cutlery out, and you had the different glasses were all put out, and the candelabra could be very ornate indeed, because you didn't need to make so much room on top of the table for all of the different dishes. Footmen were needed. So this service à la Russe was really only an option for the wealthy. And what it did do also was reduce the time that was spent at table. The waiters would come around, they would serve you with your food, you would eat it, you'd have the next course. Once the meal was finished, the ladies would get up and would withdraw to the drawing room. But it certainly left the centre of the table free for those sorts of huge centerpieces that you see in this picture. Now, which of these styles of dining do you think Anthony Trollope preferred? Well, he hated service à la Russe. He felt that it was a very bad fashion that had come into English dining rooms. Dishes were offered or were handed individually to each guest by a servant rather than being placed on the table so people could help themselves. And perhaps if you were somebody like Trollope, a little greedy, then, if you were helping yourself rather than having a servant look after you, you could perhaps take double the quantity and hope that no one would notice. It could be rather embarrassing if you had to ask the servant, please would he put more potatoes, more meat, whatever, on your dish. Trollope said that he disliked that handing around, unless it be of a subsidiary thimbleful of the best cognac, when the business of the social intercourse has been dinner. So he felt that too much of the dinner was sort of taken up with the servants being there and asking what you wanted. What he loved at a dinner party was conversation. And that quote comes from Framley Parsonage, which of course is a book that contains a fair number of dinner parties. He found the service à la Russe a vulgar and an intolerable nuisance. He didn't get his potatoes until the mutton was eaten or cold, and the wine didn't come nearly often enough, he commented. So one of the things also that it did was to get rid of the gentleman needing to carve at table. So the gentlemanly art of carving began to be of less importance because the servants carved the meat and brought it direct and put it onto your plate. Now, Trollope hated pretentious private dinner parties, and he very frequently mocks them, and he does it wonderfully in his fiction. Sometimes he depicts hostesses hysterical because they didn't know what was happening in the kitchen. He hated over-elaborate flower arrangements in the middle of the table, which meant that you couldn't look across the table to the gentleman or lady opposite to you. He loathed food that was cold or burned, something that some of the hostesses in his fiction do. And he also disliked the highly coloured desserts that were brought in from pastry cooks around the city. Trollope felt that, quote, a party of 6 is always a talking party. But if you had over 10 guests at your table, it was inevitably going to be a silent number. So as you can see, he had very definite ideas about what constituted a good dinner party. He liked the white cloth on the table. He liked that cloth being removed when the ladies withdrew and the port was passed around by the gentlemen. These were all part of the old service that he had known in his youth, not this newfangled Russian style of dining of which he so strongly disapproved. Now, there's no doubt that Trollope, when he sat down to enjoy a meal, wanted lots of food on his plate. He very much disapproves of Mrs. Mason in Orley Farm, who serves scraps of chicken and morsels. Can't you just hear Trollope's contempt in that phrase, scraps of chicken and morsels of broiled ham? He really does not like this at all. So let me share with you a little piece from, that's Mrs. Beaton, from Orley Farm about Mrs. Mason and what she puts onto the table. The lunch is on the table, sir, said the Groby Park footman in the Groby Park livery. Under the present household arrangement of Groby Park, all the servants lived on board wages. Mrs. Mason did not like this system, though it had about it certain circumstances of economy which recommended it to her. It interfered greatly with the stringent aptitudes of her character and the warmest passion of her heart. It took away from her the delicious power of serving out the servants' food, of locking up the scraps of meat, and of charging the maids with veracity. But to tell the truth, Mr. Mason had been driven by sheer necessity to take this step, as it had been found impossible to induce his wife to give out sufficient food to enable the servants to live and work. She knew that in not doing so, she injured herself, but she could not do it. The knife, in passing through the loaf, would make the portion to be parted with less by 1/3 than the portion to be retained. Half a pound of salt butter would reduce itself to 1/4 pound. Portions of meat would become infinitesimal. When standing with viands before her, she had not free will over her hands. She could not bring herself to part with victuals, though she might ruin herself by retaining them. Therefore, by order of the master, were the servants placed on board wages. Mr. Dockwrath soon found himself in the dining room, where the 3 young ladies with their mamma were already seated at the table. It was a handsome room, and the furniture was handsome, but nevertheless it was a heavy room, and the furniture was heavy. The table was large enough for a party of 12, and might have borne a noble banquet. As it was, the promise was not bad, for there were 3 large plated covers concealing hot viands, and in some houses, lunch means only bread and cheese. Mr. Mason went through the form of introduction between Mr. Dockwrath and his daughters. That is Miss Mason, that Miss Cruiser Mason, and this Miss Penelope. John, remove the covers. And the covers were removed. John, taking them from the table with a magnificent action of his arm, which I am inclined to think was not innocent of irony, on the dish, before the master of the house, a large dish, which must, I fancy, have been selected by the cook with some similar attempt at sarcasm, there reposed 3 scraps, as to the nature of which Mr. Dockwrath, though he looked hard at them, was unable to enlighten himself. But Mr. Mason knew them well, as he now placed his eyes on them for the 3rd time. They were old enemies of his, and his brow again became black as he looked at them. The scraps, in fact, consisted of 2 drumsticks of a fowl, and some indescribable bone out of the back of the same. The original bird had no doubt first revealed all its glories to human eyes, presuming the eyes of the cook to be inhuman, in Mrs. Mason's boudoir. Then, on the dish before the lady, there were 3 other morsels, black-looking and very suspicious to the eye, which in the course of conversation were proclaimed to be ham, broiled ham. Mrs. Mason would never allow a ham in its proper shape to come into the room, because it is an article upon which the guests are themselves supposed to operate with the carving knife. Lastly, on the dish before Miss Cruiser, there reposed 3 potatoes. The face of Mr. Mason became very black as he looked at the banquet which was spread upon his board, and Mrs. Mason, eyeing him across the table, saw that this was so. So a rather wonderful piece from the fabulous novel Orley Farm. So, as I said, Trollope wanted lots of food, and he disapproves of his characters who are stingy with it. And of course, Mrs. Beeton's cookbook provided a great range of recipes for people like Mrs. Mason, but I think Mrs. Mason would have found many of these recipes way too extravagant. Anthony Trollope greatly approves of Mr. Toogood, the character in the fabulous Last Chronicle of Barset. He asks his friends to take pot luck over dinner, and when they come for their, quote, pot luck, they get soup, fish, roast beef, a couple of boiled fowls, and a glass of port, such as you don't get every day in your life. There was a contrast between Mrs. Mason and Mr. Toogood. Trollope felt that every dinner ought to begin with soup and be followed by meat. He did like salads and vegetables, and he was very fond of fruit tart for dessert. He commented, "A man's own dinner is to himself so important that he cannot bring himself to believe that it is a matter absolutely indifferent to anyone else. Trollope's garden at Waltham House grew peas, beans, broccoli, cauliflower, celery, beetroot, onions, carrots, parsnips, turnips, sea kale, asparagus, French beans, artichokes, marrow, cucumbers, tomatoes, endive, lettuce, herbs, cabbages, and potatoes. So I think we can assume that Trollope continued to be very well fed in all of his different homes. He also felt very strongly that dining should be a very sociable business indeed. Who, reading The Warden, has not felt for Mr. Harding as he, in London, discussed his mutton chop and pint of port in melancholy solitude at the Chapter Coffee House? And there we can see the building where poor Mr. Harding had that solitary dinner. He's terrified, of course, that his son-in-law is likely to arrive in London and stop him doing what he feels he needs to do. He comments, "A solitary dinner in an old, respectable, sombre, solid London inn, where nothing makes any noise but the waiter's creaking shoes, where one plate slowly goes, and another slowly comes without a sound. What can be more melancholy than a mutton chop and a pint of port in such a place?" So it's all very well having good food and drink, but one really needs to enjoy company as one makes the most of that meal. Now, Trollope also in his fiction mentions picnics, outdoor dining. I think one of the greatest picnics ever is the one that we find in Jane Austen's novel, Emma, the picnic at Box Hill. So Trollope cannot beat Jane Austen's picnic in Emma, but he does give us some picnics in his novels. And in Can You Forgive Her, the first of the novels in the fabulous Palliser series, Mr. Cheesacre and Captain Belfield take Mrs. Greenow on a picnic on the beach at Yarmouth. Both these gentlemen are her suitors. They are vying for her attention like a couple of teenage boys. Trollope was not particularly fond of picnics, and one feels that picnics at the beach were something that he really didn't like. Getting sand on one's food was not something Trollope enjoyed. But the characters in Can You Forgive Her take along plenty of hampers, and they enjoy cold chicken, pie, and wine. And this is an illustration by Phiz, who illustrated Dickens's novels so famously, and it's called Captain Belfield Proposes a Toast. So from the look of the plates resting there on the beach, one suspects that plenty of sand got eaten in the course of this picnic in Trollope. So in his novels, we see a great deal about the offering or the withholding of food. And this, of course, is an index of a particular personality. We can see if someone is generous with food or stingy, like Mrs. Mason. Those who despise food or who don't tuck in with great enjoyment to their meals tend to be looked down on by their creator, Trollope, because he himself loved food. His finer characters also enjoy eating. We get some wonderful moments with the Countess de Courcy, that aristocratic character that Trollope has so much fun with in the novels. She and her daughter breakfast together. The teacups out of which they had been drinking were made of some elegant porcelain. The teapot and cream jug were of chased silver and as delicate in their way. The remnant of food consisted of morsels of French roll, which had not even been allowed to crumble themselves in a disorderly fashion, and of infinitesimal pats of butter. If the morning meal of the two ladies had been as insubstantial as the appearance of the fragments indicated, it must be presumed that they intended to lunch early. So those infinitesimal pats of butter tell us all we need to know about the personality of the Countess and her daughter. Lady Aylmer, we hear, contented herself with receiving little or no company, and with stingy breakfasts and bad dinners for herself and her husband and her daughter. So once again, we as readers know that we are expected to condemn Lady Elmer. Other characters are wonderfully generous with food. Lady Scatcherd, in my absolutely favourite novel by Trollope, Dr. Thorne, begs Mary, who is the guest in her house, to say what it was she would most like to eat or drink. And she becomes almost desperate because Mary says she doesn't care, she likes anything. And Lady Scatcherd offers this great big list of possible foods and says, please let me know what you would most like. I want to look after you. You are my guest. And she is a wonderfully generous character. So she offers roast fowl and bread sauce and a few sausages, which she assures Mary have been made at home. And she asks Mary if she prefers mashed or baked potatoes. So eventually, poor Mary, almost in desperation, chooses boiled fowl and lamb and ham. And so the characters, I think, show so much of their own personalities in their reactions and their way of dealing with food. Barchester Towers has one of my favourite food descriptions in all of Trollope. So let me take you into the fabulous home of Plumstead Episcopi. And now let us observe the well-furnished breakfast parlour at Plumstead Episcopi and the comfortable air of all the belongings of the rectory. Comfortable they certainly were, but neither gorgeous nor even grand. And he takes us into the dining room. The breakfast service on the table was equally costly and equally plain. The apparent object had been to spend money without obtaining brilliancy or splendour. The urn was of thick and solid silver, as were the teapot, coffee pot, cream ewer, and sugar bowl. The cups were old, dim dragon china, worth about £1 apiece, but very despicable in the eyes of the uninitiated. The silver forks were so heavy as to be disagreeable to the hand, and the bread basket was of a weight really formidable to any but robust persons. The tea consumed was of the very best, the coffee the very blackest, the cream the very thickest. There was dry toast and buttered toast, muffins and crumpet, hot bread and cold bread, white bread and brown bread, homemade bread and baker's bread, wheaten bread and oaten bread, and if there be other breads than these, they were there. There were eggs in napkins and crispy bits of bacon under silver covers, and there were little fishes in a little box and devilled kidneys frizzling on a hot water dish, which by the by were placed closely contiguous to the plate of the worthy Archdeacon himself. Over and above this, on a snow-white napkin spread upon the sideboard, was a huge ham and a huge sirloin, the latter having laden the dinner table on the previous evening. Such was the ordinary fare at Plumstead Episcopi. Wouldn't you just love to be invited for dinner, even if it meant you had to listen to the Archdeacon for longer than you wanted? To be invited for breakfast. It sounds absolutely magnificent. Now, food, of course, can sometimes in Trollope's novels indicate poverty, as is found by the heroine of Ayala's Angel. "I hate mutton bones," she said to her aunt one morning soon after her return. And she states that she finds eating ignoble. And Ayala complains, "Nature should have managed it differently. We ought to have sucked it in from the atmosphere through our fingers and hairs, as the trees do by their leaves. There should have been no butchers and no grease and no nasty smells from the kitchen." So I think Ayala would have loved the solid silver and the massive amount of food at the Archdeacon's home. And that, of course, is not what she finds in her much more humble living quarters. And the Crawleys, of course, from the last chronicle, also have a terrible time when it comes to paying for food. They have really struggled to pay the butcher. Lady Lufton and Lucy take them baskets of food, but Mr. Crawley often refuses food because he knows that he doesn't really have the money to pay the tradesmen and the butcher's bills. Framley Court sends over roast pork and mince pies. But Mr. Crawley becomes very suspicious about this food arriving in his house, so a great deal of subterfuge is mentioned. So once again, characters' attitudes to money, to gifts, all of these come into play when food is discussed in Trollope's novels. Now, as Anthony Trollope was only too aware, just across the ocean over in Ireland, there was a terrible famine. The Great Hunger was from 1845 to 1852. About 1 million people died and another million fled the country, emigrating to different parts of the world. And Trollope had seen for himself firsthand the effects of the potato blight. And this very unappetizing looking thing is a potato that has been affected by that terrible blight that just made the vegetable rot in the ground. Sometimes Trollope looks at the famine in his novels, although his Irish novels never sold as well as did his English ones. I think English readers felt they'd heard enough about those starving people over there in Ireland. It was not really what they wanted to read about, and so his Irish fiction never sold as well as did the novels that were set in England. But Castle Richmond combines the horrors of the 1846-47 famine with a love story. Even though Trollope knew his English readers didn't really want all this famine stuff, he felt that it was something he did need to discuss in his fiction. And he put the blame on absent landowners who were perhaps in Scotland or in England and were not taking proper care of their tenants. So he was writing Castle Richmond a long time after the famine, but clearly it was still in his mind. He writes about the starving people in Ireland. In those days, there was a form of face which came upon the sufferers when their state of misery was far advanced, and which was a sure sign that their last stage of misery was nearly run. The mouth would fall and seem to hang. The lips at the two ends of the mouth would be dragged down, and the lower part of the cheeks would fall as though they had been dragged and pulled. So Trollope had seen for himself those first-hand effects of starvation as a result of the famine. Trollope sometimes wonderfully describes his characters in terms of food. We hear Lady Monk was not beefy, whereas Mr. Slope here in this picture, we hear has a face which is not unlike beef of a bad quality. Doesn't that tell us everything we need to know about that marvellous character, Obadiah Slope? And Lady Linlithgow, aunt of Lizzie Eustace, we hear, would cheat a butcher out of a mutton chop or a cook out of a month's wages if she could. So often Trollope will give us little food references that will help him to illustrate a character. Occasionally, even their names are connected with food. Mr. Cheeseacre, Mr. Peppercorn, and John Crumb. Now, like Dr. Thorne, Trollope loved cups of tea. He hated dainty little cups, and he also loathed having to try and balance his cup of tea plus a plate of sandwiches at the same time. He said that he liked to have my teacup emptied and refilled with gradual pauses, so that time for oblivion may accrue and no exact record be taken. I think, rather like the great Dr. Samuel Johnson, Anthony Trollope was a shameless and hardened tea drinker, and he was very fond of having his cup refilled frequently. Tea, of course, was hugely popular in Victorian Britain. It had come from China by the East India Company, which had a virtual monopoly. And that monopoly was broken in 1833. Then tea began arriving from India and Ceylon. Twining's tea was, of course, expensive. All tea was expensive. Poorer families recycled it many times over. But by the 1840s, 8 London factories were recycling used tea leaves, mixing them with some new leaves and even adding a little bit of dye to bring better colour into the recycled tea. But Trollope, of course, was able to afford better quality tea. The recycled stuff was for the poor. Trollope was also fascinated by different drinks. Now, in 1872, the publisher, George Smith, and a friend of his called Dr. Ernest Hart, bought at the British concession for some German mineral water called Apollinaris. This was marketed in Trollope's day as the Queen of Table Waters. The label design was actually done by the author George du Maurier, and Apollinaris took off. 5,000 to 6,000 bottles of it were being sold every year. We hear that Plantagenet Palliser, where once he becomes the Duke of Omnium, drinks Apollinaris mineral water while his guests are swilling the wine that he has paid for. Dr. Thorne, another wonderful character, was also very fond of lemonade. We hear that Dr. Thorne was a great man for summer drinks. In his house, lemonade, currant juice, orange mixtures, and raspberry vinegar were used by the court. He frequently disapproved of these things for his patients as being apt to disarrange the digestion, but he consumed enough himself to throw a large family into such difficulties. A lovely little example of Dr. Thorne not himself practicing what he was preaching to his patients. Trollope was also fond of alcohol, and here we have Louis Trevelyan in He Knew He Was Right. And of course, alcohol becomes the ruin for Louis. The taking of little drops of brandy in the mornings becomes a major problem for this character. Some other characters drink too much. Mountjoy Scarborough in Mr. Scarborough's Family is an example. And of course, Sir Roger Scatcherd has far too much alcohol as well. Trollope himself had a serious interest in wine, and some wine snobbery does come into his fiction. Mr. Roby in The Prime Minister serves, we hear, a 57 Leoville claret, and Lord Montgrober complains it might have been good had it not been heated by the fire and put into a hot decanter. So they knew how good wine ought to be treated. In Ayala's Angel, Trollope named his favourite wine as a 64 Leoville, the most divine of nectars. In The Way We Live Now, he writes, "There is an intoxication that makes merry in the midst of affliction, and there is an intoxication that banishes affliction by producing oblivion. But again, there is an intoxication which is conscious of itself, though it makes the feet unsteady and the voice thick and the brain foolish, and which brings neither mirth nor oblivion." This is the wine cellar in the London home of Charles Dickens. I don't have a picture of Trollope's wine cellar to show you, but I can imagine that maybe it was something like that of his contemporary. We know that Trollope laid down a good wine cellar. In 1882, he told his son Harry that he was to consider 24 dozen Leoville claret and some number of Becherville wines as his own. And he said to Harry, "It is 1874 wine and will not be fit for use until 1884 at the earliest." So Trollope clearly knew what he was talking about when it came to his wines. And he commented, "I confess that I like wine. It seems to me that my dinner goes down better with a glass of sherry than without it." So there's no doubt that Trollope enjoyed a drink, as does the fabulous Dr. Thorne. Dr. Thorne loves his port wine. He loved it not as a toper, but as a collector loves his pet pictures. He liked to talk about it and think about it, to praise it and hear it praised, to look at it turned towards the light and to count over the years it had lain in his cellar. And I don't think that Trollope could have written that about his character, Dr. Thorne, had he himself not been a lover and a connoisseur of wines. So to conclude, which any good meal ought to do, of course, with dessert, we hear in Barchester Towers, "The end of a novel, like the end of a children's dinner party, must be made up of sweetmeats and sugar plums. Trollope's characters make so many different references to eating, and I think that Trollope's novels are the sweetmeats and the sugar plums that all of us who read him enjoy. His characters are as real to us as the food on our dinner plate. So I hope that today you have enjoyed a look at his works through that lens of food. But now perhaps it's time to go off and enjoy some hot buttered muffins and a cup of tea. They're calling me very loudly. It's been fabulous to join you all for this talk with fellow members of the Trollope Society. Keep reading and enjoying Trollope. I hope that one day we will all be able to meet in person when travel is allowed once again. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.